Everyone laughed when I inherited Grandpa's watch. They didn't know what was inside it. Everyone laughed when I inherited Grandpa's scratched pocket watch because my Uncle Raymond had just received the machine shop. My cousins received investment accounts, and I appeared to receive an object that no longer kept time. I remember the moment clearly because humiliation sharpens ordinary details. The room, the light, and the expressions around me all became fixed in memory. What looked small to everyone else felt like a verdict on who I was allowed to become. I did not have the language to challenge that verdict yet, so I watched, listened, and stored the truth. No one knew the back case contained a compartment made to open only when the hands were set to a date our family had chosen to forget. Raymond shook the watch beside his ear and announced that even Grandpa's smallest gift needed repair. I wrote the information down before speaking to anyone. That habit protected me from the subtle revisions that followed every confrontation. When a date later shifted or a promise became a misunderstanding, I could return to what had actually happened. The record did not make the situation less painful, but it prevented pain from being used to erase precision. I returned to the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Grandpa Samuel repaired precision instruments for 50 years and built a small manufacturing company from a garage. That detail mattered more than it seemed. In my family, and in every institution surrounding us, appearances were often accepted before facts. Once a convenient version of me had been repeated, people treated my reaction as the problem and the original cruelty as background noise. I began learning that silence protects the person who controls the story, not the person trying to survive it. I worked beside Grandpa during summers, cataloging parts and digitizing notebooks. Raymond managed sales during the last decade and told everyone the company's success came from modern contracts rather than old inventions. The practical effect reached beyond that day. It changed where I lived, how I worked, and which relationships felt safe. I became more careful without becoming cold. Caution and bitterness are not the same thing. Caution asks for consistency before trust expands. Bitterness assumes consistency is impossible. I wanted a life built on the first, not imprisoned by the second. The clearest protection remained in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The will transferred operating shares of the machine shop to Raymond, divided liquid accounts among relatives, and left me the watch by serial number. I did not respond dramatically. Years of being underestimated had taught me that anger was easiest to dismiss when it arrived before evidence. Instead, I noticed dates, names, and the order in which people changed their explanations. My restraint was not weakness. It was the beginning of a record that would eventually become harder to ignore than any rumor. Raymond ignored the warning long enough to call the bequest junk, but stopped when the lawyer requested his signature confirming its condition. A separate clause instructed the executor not to clean, appraise, or alter it before delivery. I spoke with people who had no investment in protecting the approved version of events. Their questions were simple and therefore revealing. Who benefited? Who signed? Who had access? What changed afterward? Each answer stripped away another layer of sentiment. The situation became less mysterious as soon as I stopped treating ordinary misconduct as a private misunderstanding no outsider could examine. I kept the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The watch had belonged to Grandpa's older brother Elias, who died in an industrial accident before I was born. At the time, I still believed fairness would appear if I explained myself carefully enough. I thought a complete sentence, a clean document, or one honest witness could make people choose decency. The harder lesson was that some people understand perfectly and continue anyway because confusion benefits them. Once I accepted that, my decisions became clearer and much less apologetic. Grandpa became silent whenever the accident was mentioned. Family stories blamed Elias for careless maintenance and described Grandpa as the man who rebuilt the shop afterward. That was when fear became useful. Instead of letting it circle inside me, I turned it into a checklist. I preserved files, changed passwords, requested certified copies, and wrote down every contact. Action did not eliminate uncertainty, but it gave uncertainty boundaries. Within those boundaries, I could think clearly enough to recognize choices that panic had hidden. Each review of the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. On the train home, I noticed the stopped hands pointed to 4:17 rather than midnight. The pattern was familiar. Someone else created the damage, then assigned me responsibility for preventing consequences. Competence had always been used as a reason to demand more from me. I had confused being dependable with being endlessly available. That day forced me to see the difference, and once I saw it, I could no longer return to the role they had prepared for me. When I pressed the crown at that setting, the inner dust cover released. The date window showed September 12th, the day of the accident listed in old newspapers. The consequence was not immediate, which made the waiting difficult. People who rely on pressure often interpret delay as victory. They become careless, repeat false claims, and commit themselves to details they cannot later reconcile. I let time do that work. Every additional explanation created another point that could be compared with the documents already in my possession. I relied on the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize felt practical rather than imaginary. Inside lay a thin brass key, a rolled strip of microfilm, and a number engraved beneath the balance bridge. There was nothing cinematic about my response. I went home, opened a notebook, and began arranging what I knew. Dates created a spine. Receipts and messages added weight. Memory supplied context, but I refused to rely on memory alone. I wanted a version of events that would remain true even when affection, embarrassment, and family pressure tried to soften it. Her grandfather's mark appeared beside the mechanism. A watchmaker named Ava Singh confirmed the compartment was custom-built decades earlier and documented every step before removing anything. I began noticing who asked how I was and who asked only what I planned to do. The difference separated concern from strategy. Some people wanted reconciliation before accountability because conflict made them uncomfortable. Others quietly offered dates, copies, or memories that helped. I stopped counting neutrality as kindness. In a dispute built on erasure, refusing to look usually protects the person holding the match. The trail through the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements became a structure strong enough to protect Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The engraved number matched a dormant storage vault at the First Mercantile Archive. People often imagine betrayal as one loud discovery. Mine arrived as a sequence of small contradictions: a changed time, a missing page, a casual sentence that did not match the previous one. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed alone. Together they formed a design. Recognizing that design was painful, but it also ended the exhausting work of pretending everything might still be accidental. Grandpa had paid the annual fee through a trust account no one listed in the probate inventory. The institution required proof of inheritance and an original key. Professional advice gave names to behavior I had experienced only as confusion: misrepresentation, coercion, concealment, retaliation. The words were not magic, but they organized the chaos. Once conduct had a name, it could be answered through a process rather than another circular argument. That shift returned energy I had wasted trying to make unreasonable people admit they were being unreasonable. Whenever explanations shifted, the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The vault contained engineering notebooks, patent assignments, photographs, and a sealed audio reel. I slept badly afterward, replaying every decision that had brought me there. Shame tried to persuade me that I should have predicted the harm sooner. By morning, I understood that trust was not the mistake. The mistake belonged to the person who had treated trust as an unlocked door. That distinction gave me enough steadiness to take the next practical step. My name appeared as successor custodian under an agreement signed 5 years earlier. It also held certificates for a company called Meridian Timing Systems, established by Samuel and Elias before the machine shop changed names. I checked the original source whenever possible. Screenshots could be edited, stories polished, and partial documents arranged to create a false impression. Originals carried metadata, handwriting, sequence, and context. The more closely I examined them, the less power the public version held. Truth was not louder, but it was denser. It connected in ways invention could not sustain. I preserved the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. I kept going with one standard in mind: protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The notebooks showed Elias invented a vibration damping mechanism used in industrial sensors. The people around me preferred an emotional explanation because emotion could be questioned. Records were less cooperative. A timestamp did not care who was charming. A signature did not become authentic because relatives wanted peace. A financial transfer did not turn into generosity when described at dinner. I began separating what could be proved from what others merely hoped I would accept. Grandpa spent decades correcting ownership privately without exposing the fraud publicly. After his death, Raymond's father represented the invention as Samuel's sole work and licensed it through the family shop. My instinct was to protect innocent people from the fallout, even when that protection might also shield the person responsible. I had to distinguish compassion from concealment. Compassion helps someone survive a consequence. Concealment prevents the consequence from arriving. I could offer the first without participating in the second, and that became the line I used in every decision afterward. The evidence in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Royalty statements revealed that the old mechanism had been adapted for aerospace, medical imaging, and energy equipment. For years, I had measured strength by how much discomfort I could absorb without inconveniencing anyone. That definition served everyone except me. Real strength, I discovered, sometimes looked like refusing the emergency, declining the invitation, or letting another adult meet the consequence attached to a choice. It felt unnatural at first, because healthy boundaries often feel cruel to people trained by unhealthy expectations. The watch was the key to the records controlling that trust. Payments flowed into a separate trust now worth several $1,000,000. The old version of me would have accepted a private compromise and called it peace. I now understood that secrecy was part of the mechanism. A private settlement without correction would leave the lie available for future use. I did not need public humiliation, but I did need the official record to reflect what happened. Accuracy was not revenge. It was the end of enforced confusion. I learned to trust the connections inside the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Grandpa's letter explained that the operating shop and the invention trust had been separated years ago. No single piece of information changed everything. The change came from accumulation. One document supported another, one witness explained a gap, one inconsistency made the next question unavoidable. I stopped asking whether the truth was dramatic enough and focused on whether it was complete. Completeness became my protection against a story designed to survive through exhaustion. I inherited stewardship of patents, royalty rights, and a fund intended for workers harmed by the original accident. Raymond inherited the shop's equipment, employees, debts, and ordinary contracts. Small acts of preparation began changing how I carried myself. I stopped flinching at urgent messages. I read documents twice. I asked for requests in writing. The people pressuring me described this as hostility because informality had always favored them. Structure felt aggressive only to those who depended on blurred boundaries. To me, it felt like air entering a room that had been closed for years. With the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. Every boundary became part of protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Raymond learned about the vault after the bank requested company records. I kept my plans private. The people who had underestimated me were comfortable because they mistook quiet for surrender. They expected either tears they could criticize or anger they could use as proof. I gave them neither. I gave myself time, professional advice, and permission to make decisions without announcing them to anyone who had already shown contempt for my interests. I gave him certified copies of the relevant agreement and kept the original in secure storage. He said everything developed in the shop belonged to the business he inherited and demanded the watch for inspection. I grieved while I worked. Those activities can exist together. I could miss the person I believed someone was while protecting myself from the person their choices revealed. I could remember good years without allowing those memories to cancel present evidence. Holding both truths was harder than choosing either denial or hatred, but it left me with a future not organized around resentment. The growing file of the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize, became a series of ordinary decisions. He called a family meeting and accused me of manipulating Grandpa into hiding the valuable estate. The hardest part was not gathering information. It was releasing the fantasy that the right evidence would restore the relationship I thought we had. Evidence could establish facts and shape consequences, but it could not manufacture remorse. Accepting that limitation kept me from bargaining away my safety in exchange for an apology someone offered only when every other option had failed. Their idea of sentiment appeared only after the balance sheet changed. Relatives who had laughed at the watch now described it as a family treasure that should be shared equally. When the pressure increased, I returned to the simplest question. What would I advise a stranger with the same facts? Distance made the answer obvious. I would never tell another woman to surrender records, money, work, or safety merely to prove she loved people who had already used love as leverage. I began offering myself the same basic loyalty I would have offered anyone else. I treated the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not. Protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. My attorney, Cora Bell, traced every transfer between the operating company and Meridian. By then, I understood that dignity is rarely recovered through a perfect speech. It returns through repeated choices. I answered only what required an answer. I stopped defending facts that were already documented. I allowed silence to remain in rooms where I had once rushed to make everyone comfortable. The balance of power changed before anyone else was willing to name it. Raymond had signed those statements as president. The shop paid market-rate licenses for certain technology and had repeatedly acknowledged separate ownership in audited statements. The turning point came quietly. I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to protect what mattered. Approval from the people benefiting from my silence was never going to arrive. I made the necessary call, signed the necessary form, and accepted that being misunderstood was less dangerous than remaining available for the next violation. What I could establish through the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The microfilm contained an older partnership contract between Samuel and Elias. What happened next looked sudden to outsiders, but it had been built through years of preparation. Skills gained in ordinary jobs, friendships maintained without advantage, and records kept when no one expected them to matter all converged. The same people who had mistaken patience for passivity discovered that patience can also be a method of becoming impossible to corner. After his widow died, the remainder was designated for injured machinists and technical education. It required half of invention income to support Elias's widow and descendants, but Elias had no surviving children. Later, people called the result inevitable. It was not. The result depended on small choices made while I was tired and afraid. Keeping a receipt, saving a message, asking one more question, refusing to sign. Justice often looks obvious only after someone has completed the invisible labor of making denial impossible. The discipline of maintaining the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements kept Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Grandpa had honored those payments quietly through scholarships and medical grants. I was tempted to make the outcome personal. A part of me wanted the people who had diminished me to feel exactly what I had felt, but imitation would have kept them at the center of my life. I chose a cleaner form of justice: accurate facts, consistent rules, and consequences I did not need to exaggerate. Reality was sufficient once it was finally allowed into the room. He selected me after watching how I documented anonymous scholarship requests without revealing recipients. The trust held large reserves because recent licensing income grew faster than annual distributions. That experience changed my idea of winning. Winning was not watching another person suffer. It was reaching a morning when their choices no longer determined the temperature of my day. It was having work, relationships, and a home that did not require me to shrink. The formal outcome mattered, but freedom was the part no order or judgment could award on my behalf. By following the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Raymond attempted to transfer the shop's newest contracts to a company he owned personally before the estate closed. The next development forced me to separate surprise from disbelief. Surprise passes when new information arrives. Disbelief keeps bargaining with information already present. I had spent too long bargaining. I read the facts in their plainest order and stopped inventing gentler motives simply because the real ones made me uncomfortable. The separation he challenged protected the trust from his withdrawals. He believed Meridian's royalty stream would cover debts left behind in the inherited business. I created a separate chronology for decisions still ahead. It listed what I knew, what remained uncertain, and which uncertainty actually mattered. The exercise prevented unanswered questions from becoming excuses for inaction. I did not need to solve every mystery before protecting myself from the facts already established. I returned to the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. An audit found that Raymond had underreported licensed production for 3 years. I noticed how quickly people reached for my history when they could not answer my evidence. Old mistakes, old loyalties, and old insecurities were introduced as if they changed the current facts. I refused the detour. A person can be imperfect and still be correct about what happened, and I no longer allowed unrelated flaws to become a license for mistreatment. His claim that the trust belonged to the shop would also have made his reporting more obviously fraudulent. The shop owed Meridian substantial royalties and penalties under contracts he signed. The next conversation was shorter because I no longer filled silence with concessions. I stated the necessary point, requested a written response, and ended the exchange. Removing performance from conflict made the remaining issue easier to see. The clearest protection remained in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. He offered to settle by dividing the trust among relatives if I waived the audit. The situation also revealed the cost of delayed boundaries. Every exception I had made to preserve calm had taught someone that persistence could overcome my refusal. I could not repair that lesson with another explanation. I repaired it by making the boundary predictable, written, and unaffected by the volume of the response. I refused because the money was never mine to distribute as a reward for family peace. The proposal violated the charitable remainder terms and would leave workers without promised support. I asked a professional to test my assumptions rather than merely confirm them. Where the evidence was weak, we labeled it weak. Where another explanation remained possible, we preserved that possibility. Careful limits increased credibility and kept me from becoming attached to claims the record could not support. I kept the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The audio reel held Grandpa's recorded account of Elias's death. There were days when progress looked like nothing more than not making the wrong call. I did not answer while angry, surrender while tired, or sign while rushed. Those absences were decisions. They created the space in which a better option could remain available long enough for me to recognize it. Raymond's father concealed the maintenance log to protect a government contract. A supervisor had disabled a safety interlock to meet a deadline, and Elias died while trying to stop the machine. Several documents arrived out of order, but their metadata restored the sequence. Creation dates, account numbers, and version histories exposed revisions that polished narratives had concealed. Details no one expected a reader to notice became anchors for the entire timeline. Each review of the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Grandpa admitted he remained silent because the shop employed dozens of families and he feared closure. I began treating credibility as something demonstrated through behavior rather than claimed through tone. Calm people could lie. Emotional people could tell the truth. The useful question was whether a statement remained consistent with records and later conduct. That standard protected me from charm without requiring me to distrust everyone. The recording carried remorse rather than self-exoneration. He spent the rest of his life building financial restitution while preserving evidence for a time when the company could survive the truth. I made practical plans for more than one outcome. That reduced the power of threats based on uncertainty. If the best result failed, I still had housing, work, support, and a lawful next step. Contingency planning turned fear from a wall into a set of doors. I relied on the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize felt practical rather than imaginary. Surviving maintenance records on the microfilm matched a report held in a union archive. As the timeline grew clearer, several memories changed meaning. Comments I had dismissed as jokes now looked like testing. Sudden emergencies looked like rehearsals for later pressure. I resisted the temptation to rewrite every good memory as false. The past was complicated, but complication did not require me to deny the pattern visible in the present. The discovery changed the purpose of the watch from hidden treasure to delayed testimony. Together, they cleared Elias of negligence and identified the disabled interlock. The emotional requests intensified as the formal options narrowed. I answered compassionately without changing the underlying position. Kindness did not require inconsistency, and a boundary did not become punishment merely because someone disliked meeting it. The trail through the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements became a structure strong enough to protect Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. I notified the affected workers' association before announcing financial details to relatives. The people responsible expected my empathy to weaken my position. They knew I could imagine fear, debt, ambition, and shame from another person's perspective. What they misunderstood was that understanding a motive does not erase agency. I could recognize why someone made a choice and still refuse to carry the consequence. The trust could now fulfill the obligation it had been built to carry. Its counsel helped design a claims process for families harmed by the unsafe equipment and later concealment. One witness remembered a detail everyone else had overlooked. It did not decide the matter alone, but it connected two records previously treated as separate. I documented the recollection promptly and let the appropriate process determine its weight. Whenever explanations shifted, the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Raymond sued to remove me as custodian, alleging conflict and incapacity. I allowed myself one evening to feel the full insult of it. I did not convert the feeling into a message or decision. I walked, cried, and let anger complete its honest work of showing me where a boundary had been crossed. The next morning, I could act without asking anger to design the outcome. Independent trustees, auditors, and the written succession agreement showed the role had never depended on personal wealth. He emphasized my modest salary and lack of executive title as evidence I could not manage valuable assets. I reviewed my own conduct with the same seriousness I expected from others. Where I had made assumptions, I corrected them. Where my language had been sharper than necessary, I acknowledged it. Accountability strengthened my position because it was a practice, not a weapon reserved for opponents. I preserved the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. I kept going with one standard in mind: protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. During discovery, his lawyers obtained the same audited statements bearing his signatures. Each new fact narrowed the space available for coincidence. The explanation now required too many unrelated accidents, all benefiting the same person and all disadvantaging me. Probability became its own form of clarity. I stopped apologizing for recognizing a pattern that had been carefully created. His position changed only after learning who inherited control. He had acknowledged Meridian as a separate licensor in loan applications, tax filings, and acquisition proposals. The official process imposed deadlines that emotion had never respected. Claims required support, responses required consistency, and delay carried defined consequences. Structure did not guarantee justice, but it removed many hiding places. The evidence in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The court confirmed the trust and denied Raymond's ownership claim. I changed my routines before I changed my public position. Access was reviewed, important papers moved, and private conversations limited. These choices looked excessive only if the threat was imaginary. Once the records confirmed intent, basic preparation became an ordinary expression of self-respect. Accountability did not require destroying employees who had not created the fraud. It also ordered the shop to pay overdue royalties through a structured plan designed to preserve jobs. I declined invitations to discuss the matter through intermediaries carrying incomplete messages. Triangles had kept our conflicts alive for years. Direct written communication reduced misunderstanding and prevented each person from editing the exchange for a different audience. I learned to trust the connections inside the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Raymond stepped down after the board learned he had diverted new contracts. A few people surprised me by telling the truth when doing so offered them no advantage. Their honesty did not solve the dispute, but it reminded me that loyalty and integrity were not opposites. The healthiest support came from people who did not ask me to distort facts in order to prove affection. The shop survived with less glamour and far more accurate books. A long-serving operations director became president and cooperated with safety reviews. Money became easier to discuss once every amount had a source and date. Vague phrases such as family help, shared sacrifice, or business necessity dissolved when compared with transfers and balances. Precision returned moral weight to choices that euphemisms had tried to make harmless. With the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. Every boundary became part of protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. I expanded the Trust's grants to include machine safety training, medical support, and scholarships for technicians. The pressure campaign depended on speed. Urgent calls arrived before documents, emotional appeals before complete explanations, and deadlines before independent advice. I slowed every step down. Time was not avoidance. It was the condition required for informed consent. Grandpa's secret system became an accountable institution rather than another family mystery. Every award disclosed its criteria while protecting recipient privacy. I protected time for ordinary life while the dispute continued. I worked, cooked, slept, and answered friends about subjects unrelated to the crisis. Refusing to let the conflict occupy every hour was not denial. It was practice for the life I intended to have afterward. The growing file of the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize, became a series of ordinary decisions. An independent board took over investment and claims decisions after the first year. I learned to recognize false balance. One person had acted, another had discovered it, yet observers described both as equally responsible for the conflict. That framing rewarded the original act and punished the refusal to conceal it. I would discuss my response honestly, but I would not accept half the blame for a choice I did not make. Shared authority protected the trust from repeating the family's habit of confusing stewardship with ownership. I remained custodian of the historical archive, but could no longer direct money alone. A proposed compromise solved the visible emergency while preserving the mechanism that created it. I rejected it for that reason. A durable solution had to change access, authority, or accountability, not merely postpone the next demand. I treated the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not. Protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The first public report traced every royalty dollar from license payment to reserve, grant, or restitution claim. The truth did not need me to sound invulnerable. I could admit fear, grief, and uncertainty without weakening the facts. In fact, releasing the performance of perfect strength made my decisions more accurate. I asked for help where I needed it and kept responsibility where it belonged. The record finally belonged to the people whose lives had supplied its meaning. Former workers reviewed the report before publication and corrected language that treated injuries as abstract costs. I noticed that my body recognized danger before my thoughts admitted it. Tight shoulders, shallow sleep, and the urge to check messages constantly all eased when communication moved into formal channels. Safety became measurable in ordinary physical ways. What I could establish through the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. The Museum of Industry asked to display the pocket watch with the microfilm copy and Elias's corrected record. Soon, the dispute reached people who knew none of us personally. Their distance felt frightening at first, then relieving. They were interested in authority, dates, duties, and documents rather than family roles or social rank. The questions became narrower, and the answers became harder to manipulate. A sparkling object without context would repeat the family's original mistake. I agreed only if the exhibit addressed the accident, concealment, and workers who carried the cost. The most useful allies did not promise victory. They explained risk, documented options, and told me when my preferred interpretation exceeded the evidence. Their honesty made them trustworthy in a way unconditional agreement never could. The discipline of maintaining the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements kept Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Relatives continued asking how much the watch was worth. I stopped rehearsing the speech that would finally make everyone understand. Understanding was not a prerequisite for protection. Some people would continue preferring the version that demanded least from them. My task was to make sure their preference could not control the formal outcome. Neither number measured the moral debt recorded inside it. As an antique, its appraisal was modest. As a key, it had unlocked assets and evidence worth millions. Once the central facts were accepted, the remaining arguments shifted toward intent. I understood why. People often hope a sympathetic motive will cancel an objective act. Motive can shape consequence, but it cannot make an unauthorized signature, transfer, or decision disappear. By following the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. I had Ava repair the movement without polishing the scratches or sealing the compartment. The emerging consequences were created by the original choices, not by my decision to document them. I repeated that distinction whenever guilt arrived. A smoke alarm does not start the fire, and the person who calls for help does not create the damage responders uncover. Repair preserved function without erasing history. The watch began keeping time again, but the hands could still be set to 4:17 on September 12th to open the cover. I prepared for the formal meeting by arranging the story around verified events rather than emotional importance. The most painful moment was not always the legally relevant one. Respecting that difference allowed the decision-maker to see the pattern without being asked to carry my entire grief. I returned to the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. Everyone laughed when I inherited Grandpa's watch because they assumed inheritance could be ranked by obvious market price. For the first time, I could imagine an ending that was not reconciliation or destruction. There was a third possibility: accurate distance. We could occupy the same history without sharing access, and I could release the argument without surrendering the record. Their laughter ended when the asset became visible, while my understanding began when the hidden cost did. What waited inside was not a private fortune but proof, responsibility, and a structure for returning value to people excluded from the family story. When a fair opportunity for resolution finally appeared, I evaluated it against the future rather than the insult. I asked whether it restored resources, corrected the record, and reduced the chance of repetition. Satisfaction mattered less than stability. The clearest protection remained in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. On the anniversary of the accident, the shop stopped production for 17 minutes and read Elias's corrected safety record aloud. The result began taking shape through ordinary procedures rather than dramatic revelation. Notices were delivered, accounts reconciled, and statements compared. That quiet machinery mattered because it gave the truth somewhere to go after private appeals had failed. For the first time was no longer being used to bury what happened. I stood beside retired workers with the watch ticking in my pocket. After the decision, I changed passwords and routines one final time, then stopped checking for new harm every hour. Protection that never allows vigilance to end becomes another kind of captivity. I wanted safeguards strong enough to let attention return to life. I kept the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. The choice served a larger purpose, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize. I did not leave the experience unchanged. I became slower to confuse familiarity with safety and less willing to treat urgency as authority. That was not cynicism. It was the discipline of making room for facts before surrendering Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. The official record eventually became shorter than the years leading to it. A few pages contained dates, findings, and consequences. What those pages could not show was the private work required to stop organizing my life around my Uncle Raymond and the relatives who followed him. People sometimes asked whether I felt vindicated. The word suggested a single, satisfying moment, but recovery was quieter. It arrived when I could think about the future without first calculating how my Uncle Raymond and the relatives who followed him might react. I kept copies of the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements in one secure place and stopped carrying them through every ordinary day. Evidence had completed its job. I was allowed to build a life in which protection existed without constant vigilance. In the end, protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize required more courage than any public confrontation. It meant refusing to become a mirror of the behavior that hurt me. I could insist on consequence without making cruelty my inheritance. The people who had watched from a distance preferred to describe the ending as a reversal of fortune. That description missed the years of work between injury and consequence. Nothing had turned by magic. I had simply stopped donating my silence, labor, and doubt to a version of events that protected my Uncle Raymond and the relatives who followed him. I also learned that an accurate ending does not require every relationship to be repaired. Some connections became smaller, some disappeared, and a few became more honest after access was no longer automatic. Loss remained loss, but it no longer had authority over Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it. Looking back, the decisive moments were rarely the loudest ones. They were the mornings when I preserved one more file, asked for one more explanation in writing, or declined to solve a crisis I had not created. Those choices accumulated until protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize was no longer an idea, but the shape of my daily life. I did not tell the story to prove that patience always wins. Patience without action can become permission. What protected me was patient action, checking the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements, seeking advice, and choosing a response that would still make sense after the immediate anger passed. There are parts of the experience I still dislike remembering. Healing did not turn betrayal into a useful gift, and success did not make the original harm necessary. I grew because I worked to recover, not because my Uncle Raymond and the relatives who followed him secretly taught me a lesson I should be grateful to receive. The future became ordinary again in the best possible way. I made plans without building them around another person's emergency. I spent time with people who could hear no without treating it as abandonment. The protection of Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it stopped feeling like a battle and became part of how I lived. If I had one truth to give the person I was at the beginning, it would be this: evidence is not cold, boundaries are not cruelty, and refusing to carry another adult's consequence is not revenge. Those tools made room for protecting Grandpa's intentions without becoming another person who valued only the prize when promises and apologies could not. Eventually, I could hold the whole history without needing to change its ending in my imagination. The facts were established, the consequence belonged where it fell, and my attention was free to move elsewhere. That freedom was the outcome I had wanted long before I knew how to name it. Time did not erase what happened, but it changed the scale. What once filled every thought became one completed part of a much larger life. I could remember my Uncle Raymond and the relatives who followed him without immediately returning to the moment when Grandpa's real legacy and the work behind it seemed most vulnerable. The final proof was not contained in the watchmaker's notes, vault records, patents, and royalty statements. It appeared in my habits. I no longer apologized for careful questions, confused pressure with love, or waited for an unfair person to approve my boundary. The documents had secured the record. Living differently secured the future.